Many men are taught that emotional availability is the foundation of healthy relationships, and they internalize this idea as a requirement to always be open, responsive, and emotionally expressive. They believe that sharing feelings freely, discussing doubts, and verbalizing emotional states will naturally create intimacy and trust. From a rational perspective, this belief makes sense. In most systems, transparency reduces friction, and openness signals maturity. Men apply this logic directly to relationships, assuming that emotional access functions like information exchange. If both sides share honestly, alignment should follow. However, emotional availability is often misunderstood, not because it is harmful, but because it is practiced without internal structure. When a man opens emotionally without grounding, availability turns into exposure. Instead of signaling depth, it signals permeability. There is no clear center from which the emotion is shared. The woman does not experience this as intimacy. She experiences it as emotional diffusion. His feelings feel uncontained, as if they are spilling outward rather than being held internally. Emotional availability, when driven by a desire to connect, be understood, or prevent distance, subtly communicates that the man is seeking regulation through the relationship. He is not sharing from abundance, but from a need to stabilize himself. The intention may be sincere, but emotional systems respond to posture, not intention. This is why many men feel confused when openness produces distance rather than closeness. They believe they did what they were told was right, yet the dynamic shifts anyway. What they fail to see is that emotional availability without internal stability does not feel safe. It feels undefined. Until a man understands that availability must emerge from containment rather than urgency, he will continue to confuse openness with intimacy and vulnerability with strength. The critical distinction most men miss is that emotional availability is evaluated not by what is shared, but by how it is held. A man may express vulnerability, but the emotional system responds to whether that vulnerability comes from choice or from pressure. When sharing is driven by anxiety, fear of distance, or the need for reassurance, it places emotional weight on the other person. The woman senses that his internal state now partially depends on her response. This does not feel like closeness. It feels like responsibility. Emotional systems do not respond well to responsibility imposed through intimacy. They respond to freedom. When a man shares without containment, he unintentionally blurs emotional boundaries. His feelings are no longer his to manage. They become part of the relational environment. Over time, this creates subtle tension. The woman may not consciously reject his openness, but she begins to feel constrained by it. She senses that emotional movement requires careful handling. The relationship starts to feel emotionally heavy, even if nothing overtly negative is happening. The man experiences her withdrawal as confusing or unfair. He believes he is being honest and emotionally present. What he does not realize is that emotional availability without stability removes the sense of safety that intimacy requires. Stability is what allows vulnerability to be received without pressure. Without it, openness becomes noise rather than signal. The more the man shares in an attempt to restore connection, the more pressure he creates. Until he understands that emotional availability must be grounded in self-regulation rather than relational regulation, openness will continue to produce the opposite of its intended effect. As emotional availability becomes habitual rather than intentional, it slowly transforms into neediness, even when the man does not perceive himself that way. He begins to share preemptively, filling silence with emotional updates, explanations, and disclosures. What he believes is honesty becomes emotional leakage. The relationship becomes saturated with feeling, leaving little space for natural desire to form. Emotional proximity replaces emotional polarity. The woman experiences this not as deeper intimacy, but as emotional crowding. She feels that closeness is being requested rather than invited. This subtle shift changes the entire dynamic. Desire cannot be requested. It must emerge in space. When emotional availability becomes constant, it loses contrast. The man's presence becomes emotionally predictable. There is no tension between what is known and what is felt. Instead of depth, there is exposure. Instead of intimacy, there is transparency without restraint. This is why emotional availability, when misunderstood, often correlates with declining attraction rather than increased connection. The man believes he is being open. The emotional system reads dependence. Emotional strength includes the capacity to hold one's internal state without immediately externalizing it. When a man lacks this capacity, sharing becomes compulsive rather than expressive. Until emotional availability is restrained by internal discipline, it functions less like intimacy and more like a request for regulation. Healthy emotional availability is not constant expression. It is selective access. A man who is emotionally available does not broadcast his internal state in real time. He chooses when and how to share based on alignment rather than impulse. His emotions exist fully within him before they are offered outward. This containment is what makes sharing feel grounded rather than heavy. The woman experiences his openness as strength because it does not demand response or reassurance. He is not asking her to stabilize him. He is simply allowing her to see him. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Emotional availability becomes attractive when it is optional rather than automatic. Silence no longer feels like withdrawal. Emotional expression no longer feels like pressure. The relationship regains space to breathe. Paradoxically, this often increases intimacy. Fewer disclosures carry more weight. Emotional moments become meaningful rather than frequent. The man no longer feels compelled to prove closeness through sharing. He trusts that connection does not require constant emotional visibility. This restores polarity. Mystery returns. Desire has room to exist. Emotional availability finds its proper place, not as exposure, but as deliberate connection. When a man understands this, he stops confusing openness with intimacy and starts embodying a form of presence that allows intimacy to emerge naturally without being forced or managed. What ultimately separates healthy emotional availability from its misunderstood form is containment. Containment is not suppression, and it is not emotional coldness. It is the ability to experience emotion fully without immediately externalizing it in order to relieve discomfort. A man who has containment does not deny his feelings, but he also does not hand them off to the relationship to manage. This distinction changes how emotional availability is perceived. When a man can hold his internal state without urgency, his sharing becomes intentional rather than compulsive. The woman experiences this as emotional maturity, not distance. She feels that the man is present with himself first, and therefore present with her by choice rather than need. Containment creates safety because it removes pressure. There is no demand for response, reassurance, or alignment. Emotional space opens naturally. The relationship no longer feels like a channel for emotional regulation, but like a place where emotion can be shared freely without consequence. This is why men who appear less emotionally expressive often create deeper intimacy over time. Their emotions are not absent, they are integrated. When they do share, it feels grounded and complete rather than unresolved. Each disclosure carries weight because it is not driven by anxiety. Over time, this retrains the emotional system of the relationship. Emotional moments settle instead of escalating. Silence becomes neutral instead of threatening. Closeness feels chosen rather than required. Emotional availability in this form stops being something a man does and becomes something he allows. He no longer tries to create intimacy through expression. He creates the conditions where intimacy can arise on its own. And it is this quiet containment, not constant openness, that ultimately deepens connection without eroding attraction. Most men interpret comfort in relationships as a sign of success. When conflict disappears, communication feels easy, and emotional friction fades, they assume the relationship has reached a stable and desirable state. Comfort signals safety, predictability, and acceptance. In logical systems, this is the goal. Stability means fewer problems and less effort spent managing risk. Men apply this same framework to relationships, believing that once comfort is established, attraction will naturally persist. They relax, reduce uncertainty, and prioritize emotional ease. What they do not realize is that emotional comfort and attraction do not grow in parallel. Comfort solves anxiety, but attraction responds to tension. When a relationship becomes fully comfortable, emotional contrast begins to disappear. Everything becomes known, familiar, and expected. The man experiences this as peace. The woman experiences it as emotional flattening. Nothing feels wrong, but nothing feels alive either. Men rarely notice this shift because it happens gradually. There is no clear conflict or breakdown to signal a problem. Comfort feels earned, so they protect it. They reduce challenge, avoid disruption, and reinforce routine. From their perspective, this is maturity. From an emotional system perspective, it is stagnation. Attraction does not disappear because comfort exists. It disappears because comfort replaces polarity. Until a man understands that comfort and desire are governed by different mechanisms, he will continue to mistake emotional ease for relational health. Polarity requires contrast. It emerges from difference, direction, and movement. Comfort, when unchecked, slowly erodes each of these elements. As routines solidify, behavior becomes predictable. Emotional responses become consistent. Reactions are anticipated before they occur. The relationship begins to feel closed rather than dynamic. The man often believes this predictability signals reliability. He shows up the same way, responds the same way, and maintains emotional availability without fluctuation. What he does not see is that predictability removes tension. Without tension, desire has nothing to respond to. The woman does not consciously decide to lose attraction. She simply stops feeling it with the same intensity. The emotional system is no longer stimulated. Everything feels resolved. When a man senses this shift, he often responds by increasing reassurance, closeness, or emotional presence, believing that more connection will restore what feels lost. This response accelerates the problem. Comfort increases, polarity decreases further. The relationship becomes emotionally saturated, but energetically flat. The woman experiences this not as safety, but as emotional enclosure. There is no space for anticipation, curiosity, or movement. Attraction fades not because something went wrong, but because nothing is allowed to change. Comfort becomes a closed loop. Until a man recognizes that polarity requires space and direction, he will continue reinforcing comfort in ways that quietly dismantle desire. Men often protect comfort because it feels fragile. Once achieved, they fear disrupting it. They avoid behaviors, conversations, or decisions that might introduce tension. This avoidance is interpreted as consideration and emotional intelligence. In reality, it is fear-based maintenance. The man prioritizes emotional ease over movement. Direction weakens. Decisions become reactive rather than intentional. The relationship adapts around comfort instead of progressing through challenge. The woman senses this shift as loss of momentum. There is no clear forward pull. Everything feels settled, but not anchored to growth. Over time, she may introduce disruption unconsciously, not to create conflict, but to reintroduce movement. Small disagreements, emotional distance, or changes in behavior emerge. The man misreads these signals as threats to stability. He responds by reinforcing comfort even more. This creates a feedback loop where comfort becomes both the goal and the constraint. The more the man tries to preserve peace, the more attraction slips away. Comfort begins to function like emotional insulation, dulling sensation rather than supporting connection. Until a man understands that comfort must exist within direction, not replace it, he will continue mistaking emotional stillness for relational strength. Attraction does not require chaos, conflict, or emotional volatility. It requires movement. Movement can exist without instability, but it cannot exist without direction. A man who sustains attraction does not eliminate comfort. He contextualizes it. Comfort becomes a base, not a destination. His presence remains grounded, but his life continues to move forward independently of the relationship. He makes decisions, pursues goals, and maintains internal direction that is not negotiated through emotional ease. This creates contrast. The relationship feels stable but not closed, familiar but not stagnant. The woman experiences this as security with momentum. There is no need to manufacture tension because movement exists naturally. The man does not need to withdraw or provoke distance. He simply remains oriented towards something larger than emotional maintenance. This preserves polarity without sacrificing safety. Comfort is no longer something that must be protected. It becomes something that exists alongside desire. Attraction remains alive because the relationship is part of a larger trajectory rather than the end point itself. Until comfort is repositioned as a support structure rather than a goal, attraction will continue to erode quietly over time. The moment a man stops trying to preserve comfort and allows the relationship to breathe, desire often begins to return on its own. This does not require creating distance or withholding affection. It requires releasing the fear of disruption. When a man tolerates emotional fluctuation without rushing to restore ease, he reintroduces elasticity into the system. Comfort becomes flexible rather than rigid. The woman feels that the relationship can move without collapsing. This restores trust at a deeper level. Desire responds to this openness. There is room again for curiosity, anticipation, and emotional engagement. The man no longer treats comfort as something that must be defended. He allows it to exist naturally, alongside challenge and movement. This changes how presence is felt. The relationship stops feeling like a controlled environment and starts feeling like a living process. Attraction does not need to be forced or maintained. It reemerges because the conditions that suppressed it are no longer reinforced. Comfort, when allowed to expand and contract, stops killing attraction and starts supporting it. When a man understands this, he stops choosing peace over polarity and starts embodying a form of stability that allows both to coexist. Comfort itself is not what destroys attraction. Fixation on comfort is. When a man becomes emotionally attached to everything staying smooth, familiar, and predictable, he trades presence for preservation. The relationship stops being a place of shared movement and becomes something that must be protected from disruption. This shifts his posture subtly but decisively. He reacts faster, adjusts more, and avoids tension instead of absorbing it. The woman feels this immediately. Comfort no longer feels optional. It feels enforced. Attraction fades, not because safety exists, but because safety is no longer flexible. When a man allows comfort to exist without clinging to it, it stops suffocating desire. Stability regains elasticity. The relationship can stretch without breaking. Comfort becomes supportive instead of restrictive. At that point, attraction no longer competes with peace. It coexists with it.